more people have lymphatic diseases than AIDS, Alzheimer's, and a couple of Parkinson's, and a couple of these that everyone knows combined. So if you take all those diseases and combine them, more people have lymphatic disease than those. But those diseases have done a really good job of raising awareness amongst the public, and then the public has said, hey, we need to fund these to fix these, to cure these diseases and help these diseases. And so the money's there, and then the science follows the money. And, we're not quite there yet, I think, in the field of lymphatics.
Hi, Dr. Dixon. Thank you for having us. You're a mechanical engineer and you study lymphatic system. Could you tell us a little bit more about what the lymphatics are and how did you get into this field?
Sure. Yeah, I was. So when I was doing my PhD, I was always very interested in sort of the physics of blood flow, and I thought it was fascinating. I remember hearing a lecture that cells can sense fluid force and respond biologically in an appropriate manner. And I thought that was just fascinating to me. And so I was working in an area of like biomedical optics and imaging and trying to develop tools for sensing in the lab I was in. And we ended up, my mentor at the time scheduled a meeting with a professor at the medical school, and he worked in lymphatic physiology, and I had no idea what that even meant. But I went out there and met him, and he described that our bodies, we have this secondary circulatory system that's constantly taking fluid from our interstitial spaces, proteins, immune cells, and returning it back to the circulation. And so the human body returns anywhere from 8 to 12 liters a day of fluid back into your blood circulation. And I was fascinated because I'd never heard of this, and then he showed me some videos, and it was a quite mechanically complicated system, but sort of simple and beautiful at the same time. So these vessels, because there is no heart to push fluid, they generate their own force by pumping, and there's hundreds of them in a row with valves that move fluid. And so it's really in many senses it's a mechanical system, and so I thought it would be an interesting thing to study as an engineer. How does this system work? And then, of course, as I got into it and realized that there are all these rare and not so rare diseases in the lymphatics, and there are these patients that don't feel that there is anything being done in research to help alleviate their condition, and that we know very little, and that things have not progressed. It was a huge opportunity for me to sort of say, well, I wonder what we could do. And of course, this was back in 2000, really 2003 or 2004 when I first learned about it. I can say we've come a long way as a field in almost 20 years, but we still don't have a cure for lymphedema. There's, like in the U.S. alone, there are up to 10 million patients that suffer from lymphatic diseases and lymphedema. So I guess I probably didn't even define that term, but lymphedema itself it's a chronic condition. When the lymphatics fail to drain fluid, you get a gross remodeling of the affected region. So, for example, in breast cancer-related lymphedema, a lot of the patients that are recovering from cancer and develop this swelling and pathology in their arms. Not only does the size of the arm change, but the composition changes. The limb is more susceptible to infection. It becomes fibrotic, and there is no cure. And so, that's what the lymphatics are. That's how I kind of initially stumbled into it as an engineer. And it's an area that we've the lab I've worked in since then. I was really fortunate to go do a postdoc for 3 years in Switzerland with a professor who was an engineer as well, who studied lymphatic biology, and then came here to Georgia Tech in 2009. And it's been an area we've worked in ever since.
And if you need to introduce lymphatics to someone who had just high school biology and there was probably a paragraph on that, what are the, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 things that someone needs to know about lymphatics just as, you know, human being?
Okay, so anytime, you know, I'm not sure in Belarus how your diet is. Our diet in the U.S. is, we call it a Western diet. It's very lipid rich. And so anytime you eat food that is really rich in lipid, it turns out almost all dietary lipid is taken up by your intestine and then transported to the lymphatics in your intestine. And the lymphatics provide the route for that fluid to make it into the circulation and reach the rest of your body. And so, you know, the ability to actually just to take up a bunch of lipid and store it is provided a huge survival advantage, because back when we were wanderers, we didn't eat 3 times a day, and you needed to be able to, when you found food, you needed to be able to eat it and then store it for a long period of time. And the lymphatics are key in that process. Actually, interesting little anecdote. There's a lot of debate about who discovered lymphatics and when were they first documented, et cetera. One documentation of the lymphatics and their discovery, if you will, was by an Italian physician scientist named Zali. And he writes, you can actually read transcripts of his publications, and he even tells this story of he sort of accidentally stumbled upon it because they were dissecting a dog and saw all these white vessels in the draining from the intestine, and they'd never seen that before. Tried to reproduce it, couldn't reproduce it. Eventually realized what had happened was they had done that dissection shortly after the dog had eaten, and that hadn't happened in the past. And so when they recreated that, fed the dog, and then dissection, you could see all the vessels again. So it turns out your vessels appear nice and white right after you eat because of all the lipid that's being taken up. So that's fact number 1. Lymphatics take up all lipid. Another highly relevant importance of the lymphatics is in immune responses. And then so probably many of you have had, you know, the Pfizer, Moderna COVID shot given in your arm, or even any flu vaccine. And you notice often when you get in a shot, 24 hours later, you feel really sore right here. And that's because that's where the lymph nodes are that are draining that basin where you got the shot. And so the lymphatics actually provide the network of roads, if you will, that take that antigen or take that vaccine and move it from this site here, or the site of infection if you're sick, to the lymph node. And facilitate the immune response. And so lymphatics are crucial in our ability to develop these both adaptive and innate immune responses. And while the lymph nodes are sort of you could think of it as the centers where everything is, all the sort of response is facilitated and cells go out and do their job, the lymphatics provide the routes for all those signals and cells to reach these centers, and then from there go disseminate the information and act upon it. So that's the second thing. And the third maybe thing I think of with the lymphatics is, anytime it storms, if you have an effective drainage system on your roads, you see the water always goes away to certain locations, and it always drains through, and that's necessary so that you don't end up with feet of standing water that you're trying to drive through. And the lymphatics effectively do that. They're constantly draining fluid from your interstitium. And when they don't do that effectively, you could imagine something similar, a buildup of fluids. So I think those 3 things, uptake of fat, transport of immune cells in response to infection, and then return of fluid and sort of drainage, are the 3 most important things the lymphatics do. And they have to do it continuously. It's sort of part of normal human health.
So when lymphatics don't function properly, why is that happening?
Yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. So globally, actually, in terms of pure numbers of patients, still the largest lymphatic disease is probably lymphatic filariasis. So this is a parasitic disease in which a parasite that gets transmitted by a mosquito migrates through your skin into the lymphatics into the vessels. And so if you've heard of elephantiasis or elephantitis, that's like the severe manifestation and pathology of lymphatic filariasis. There are still, estimated 1 billion people that are at risk for getting lymphatic filariasis because they live in regions where it's endemic and there are mosquitoes. And I think there are over 100 million people that have that form of lymphedema. It's not something that we have in the U.S. or have had in a long time, really. You'd have to go pre-Civil War to find documented cases of filariasis here in the U.S. But we did have them in this area in Georgia then. So that's sort of globally the biggest cause. I think in sort of what we might call developed countries or the U.S., Western Europe, even lots of places like Japan and China now. Secondary lymphedema is the more common form of lymphedema due to cancer is the biggest cause. So cancer treatment, the therapy and the surgery, all these things are risk factors. And what it ultimately boils down to is the lymphatic vasculature is physically damaged. So often in cancer therapy, you're worried about metastasis. And so if there's lymph node involvement and you see metastasis in lymph nodes, you need to remove those, and you need to remove the primary tumor. In doing so, that lymphatic vasculature gets damaged, and in some patients, it seems to not regenerate effectively, and over time fails, and those patients develop lymphedema. And lastly, you do have primary lymphedemas, which are genetic in cause, and so these are due to, there's a variety of genes that have been discovered so far, but there are others we don't know where the lymphatics don't form properly, and that can cause lymphedema. And these are much more rare than secondary lymphedema, like in cancer patients, but there still are many patients that have these diseases as well.
How does one get diagnosed with lymphedema? Is there a particular methodology that physicians use, or is it something you notice?
I think that question is probably really different depending on the healthcare system that you're talking about in the context. It's still very understudied and under-recognized even in the United States. So, usually if you have had cancer, then you're going to have follow-up visits, and typically, I think most places, almost in the U.S. now that have treated patients with cancer, they're going to educate their patients about lymphedema and have them be aware of it. So one method might be self-diagnosis. If the patient's educated, then maybe they would recognize that something's going wrong and be able to get diagnosed. There's, they do things like look for, if you go in for a physical diagnosis, they may do something to look for pitting, basically. So you make a really firm depression. And then if you have lymphedema, then when you do that, it'll push the fluid away. And when you release the thumb, it'll take some time for that fluid to come back. Just measuring volume, it can be a way to track lymphedema. If you have some baseline reference, like say before cancer surgery and after, you could look for change in volume over time. One other thing you could do is look at differences in volume. In a lot of secondary lymphedemas, that's what's called unilateral. So it may present only in one side, one leg, one arm, one region of the neck. And so asymmetry or differences can be a way to be diagnosed. You could also look for, there's something known as bioimpedance spectroscopy, where basically you're trying to measure differences in tissue conductivity as a measure of differences in water content. And so that's a possibility. I will say there's kind of a variety of ways that people maybe screen or look out for or try to diagnose lymphedema, including some imaging methods as well, where maybe you put a tracer in and you try to see how effectively that tracer is drained from where you inject it. But I think in the U.S., diagnosis is tightly coupled to the way that we pay for healthcare. And so if things aren't reimbursed or they don't have, CPT codes, or it's not built into the sort of standard follow-up, then it may not be, may not be diagnosed. And there aren't, it's something that there aren't a lot of CPT codes directly linked to lymphedema diagnostics and therapy in the U.S. or they're just now becoming available. I can't really speak on authoritative healthcare systems outside where maybe there are more robust methods of surveillance and monitoring.
And how long does it take for a patient to be diagnosed? Is that a year or longer?
Yeah, well, so there's, I guess, how long does it take to be diagnosed versus how long does it take for lymphedema to develop? And those aren't necessarily the same depending on how far after the acquisition of lymphedema the diagnosis occurs. Most patients, the literature suggests that if it's a secondary lymphedema that's going to occur because of cancer treatment or something like that, that it will present, I'd say with a half of the patients present within a few years, maybe 6 months to a few years after therapy or surgery. But there have been other studies that have tracked patients for a long period of time, up to 15 years, and the other half of those patients may continue to present with lymphedema. Half of the patients that will get lymphedema don't present with it until many, many years later. And so it's to some extent, if you're a cancer survivor, it's this kind of thing always in the back of your mind of, well, is this something I'm going to get? I didn't get it a year after it. And there are many patients that, in a sense, have forgotten about the fact that they're a cancer survivor. It was 10 years ago, and then suddenly you're surprised when they start to develop lymphedema. And it can be surprising that it can take that long to develop in some cases.
And you mentioned that there's no cure for lymphedema.
Yeah.
So what are the current treatments and how the cure may be developed?
Sure. Yeah. So I think in most places, the standard therapy is still medical compression. So basically you wear a garment for the rest of your life, and the goal of the garment is to keep your leg or arm from getting any bigger than it already is. Maybe you'll go in and do what's called manual lymphatic drainage. So a trained therapist will remove as much fluid out as they can through specialized massage. And then once you get all the fluid out, then you wear compression so that it keeps it from getting larger. And then you have to wear compression the rest of your life. I will say there have been some exciting developments in the surgical space where there's a couple of different microsurgeries that have shown to be very promising for some patients in resolving lymphedema or minimizing it. So one is called a vascularized lymph node transfer. So what they do is they take lymph nodes from an unaffected site in a patient and then transfer them to the site of lymphedema, hook up the blood supply, and the thought is that lymph node provides some source of lymphangiogenesis and grows lymphatics, and that fluid can get returned through that lymph node to the circulation. And I've read, and then another surgical approach is what's called a lymphatic venous anastomosis. And so what they do there is they go within affected limb. If I can find a lymphatic vessel that's functional, but maybe there's a blockage downstream, then what they do is they actually take that lymphatic vessel that's functional and they hook it in and connect it to the vein locally, rather than, because in normal physiology, lymph travels all the way up to your body and is returned to the venous circulation primarily through the thoracic duct and a few other locations in the veins up near the heart. And so what this does is returns the fluid back to the circulation at the local vein, wherever the site of lymphedema is. And the people that have done large numbers of these studies, it suggests that this is effective in resolving lymphedema in maybe about 40% of the patients. So it's you can think that's 40% of the patients that had no cure that now there's a solution for, but there's still a large percentage that don't. In addition, the surgery is very technically challenging, and so there's only in the U.S., for example, there's only a handful of places that have the surgeons with the necessary technical training to actually perform this procedure. But that's another therapy. There have been a handful of drugs that have gone through phase 2 clinical trials, but nothing has taken off yet and is available for patients. So, but I think thinking about where we were 20 years ago and where we are now, I think we're on the cusp, hopefully, of, as a community, of finding something that will at least help many patients that previously had no cure or hope for a cure.
How lymphedema affects the quality of life for those patients? Are there any further complications that may be caused by lymphedema itself?
Yeah, sure. So if you imagine if you have the reason you have lymphedema in your limb is because those lymphatics aren't working very well, and so one of the main things they do is respond to inflammatory challenges, and so those patients often have a much higher risk of developing infection, and they can get dermatitis, and then have these secondary events, and once that happens, they can have sort of chronic flare-ups because the normal immune function in that limb is not working. So that's certainly one thing. In quality of life in general, some patients get lymphedema so bad they physically cannot walk. If you're talking about 10 liters of fluid in one leg, imagine, strapping 10 liters of, or 5 2-liter Coke bottles to your leg and tying them on and having to walk around with that. It's just practically can become impossible to walk. Normal clothes, clothes don't fit because they don't make clothes where one pant leg is 4 times larger than another, or same with arms. So many patients end up on disability. They can't work. And so there's all the quality of life things associated with that. Obviously, there's really, really high rates of depression, suicide among patients because there's no end in sight, there's no cure. But it's not like cancer, say, or where you don't die from lymphedema. So it's just sort of not only is there no end in sight, but there's not even like a final end, if you will. It's like, no, you're going to now live with this for 30 years, which has its own, challenges, that just by the fact that it's not lethal, but at the same time, it's going to be a burden you're going to have to carry forever. So all those things, I think, and of course in the U.S. there's a huge financial component too, because the cost to manage your lymphedema and treat it for the rest of your life is substantial, and often our healthcare doesn't support the cost of compression garments and things like that. There's a thing called in the U.S. called the Lymphedema Treatment Act that's been championed before Congress for several years now. It still hasn't been passed or gone into law to try and get health insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, to reimburse just the cost of compression garments and standard lymphedema care.
And how obesity and lymphedema, do they go together often? And there's also lipedema, so that's deposition of fat.
Yeah. Okay. So, certainly we know, like with almost every disease, obesity significantly elevates your risk of lymphedema. But I would say that there's been a lot of sort of interesting, exciting research in animal models that would suggest that maybe even obesity itself has a lymphatic component that's driving sort of the severe manifestation of obesity. If the lymphatics are responsible for clearing lipid, and obesity drives lots of inflammation, could there be a connection there? I think we still don't really understand how lymphatic function and, say, dysfunction might predispose a person to severe forms of obesity. And then you mentioned lipedema. That's a really interesting disease. It's an abnormal fat storage disorder that affects women at a much higher rate than men. And there's been a handful of studies that show that the lymphatic circulation is compromised in these patients, but we don't really know how the lymphatics may be a major player in that, whether they're a therapeutic target. And again, it looks at first glance it looks very similar to lymphedema, except rather than a fluid balance problem, it's a fat storage problem, but it's a local fat storage problem. So in lipedema, it's not, oh, you just have lots of lipid everywhere. It can be very specific locations where you end up with significant limb enlargement because of that.
And how your lab research sort of helps treat lymphedema, or what do you study in your lab that may advise?
Yeah, so I mean, the way I like to describe what we do, I say we're engineers that study the lymphatic system, and so it's a complicated cardiovascular system that integrates with biology and physiology, and so we collaborate with clinicians and with basic scientists and with biologists. Because we want to understand maybe how cell signaling is involved, but at the same time we're engineers. So a question we often ask ourselves is, when is a gap in our understanding due to a technical challenge, and that has an engineered solution to it, or even a treatment? We work with material scientists to develop methods to deliver drugs directly to lymphatics, to modulate them or promote their regeneration. We're looking at other biomaterial strategies to help directly grow lymphatics, and so that's another approach we've taken. We had one of my very first PhD students. We launched a company together on this issue of diagnostics, and we found that the state of the art for tracking lymphedema and actually fitting medical compression garments, which is the primary treatment for lymphedema, was a Taylor's tape measure. And these people would go to the physical therapy school and get trained how to make accurate measurements of a person's limb volume, filling out a spreadsheet with if they're really sophisticated, the formula was embedded in Excel or something, and you'd pull a tape measure out and make measurements. And we thought, well, why are we using this, 1940s technology still to calculate? Maybe Excel's newer than that. I can't remember when it was started, but to track lymphedema. And so the company we ended up launching is called Lymphatic, and it's digital measurements for lymphedema, both for tracking the disease, but also for fitting medical compression garments. And so they've partnered with many of the medical compression garment manufacturers to automate and standardize the sizing process of medical compression for patients with lymphedema, using this sort of digital imaging. Another area that's new that's been really fun. We've been working with a children's hospital here. There's a disease that primarily affects pediatric patients, known as lymphatic malformations. And so this is due to there's a mutation in the lymphatic endothelial cell that causes this rapid overgrowth in these babies. That can actually be lethal depending on where the malformation is occurring. They have to go in and they try to do surgery, but sometimes you can't remove the malformation depending on where it is. And so there are medical therapies people are trying. There's something called sclerotherapy. And so we've been working to get patient samples from children that have this and then growing lymphatic malformations outside the body in sort of what we call these organoid models, so that we can try to test new therapeutics and understand why some therapeutics may work on some patients but not the others. And so that's kind of another area that we've been working in the lab. And then, as an engineer, we also are very interested in like the basic mechanics of how do these things work. So we get lymphatic vessels, we mechanically test them, how strong are they contracting, how much flow do they generate, et cetera. And then we develop mathematical models that capture that. So for example, if we want to know, what if my lymphatic valve develops a plaque on it and becomes stiffer? What does that mean? How does that impact performance? And so we can run computational simulations to sort of link those changes in structure to function. And so we do that, and then we have animal models where we can validate those computational models, and we can do we can damage lymphatics in an animal model. much like what you did actually when you were working in my lab. Yanina developed a method to use something called photodynamic therapy to create a local oxygen reaction through light at a region that would damage the lymphatics at that location, and then over time they would start to leak more. And so we developed these models where we can do those damages and look at how those damages affect changes long term. So
what were the most fascinating things you as a researcher found during your career, or maybe just things that kind of happened in the field that were the most exciting for you?
Most exciting.
Or surprising?
Yeah. I think one thing that was one interesting thing we kind of stumbled on, there was a group that had published, I remember distinctly being at a conference, seeing these results, and it was Peter Mortimer was the person, or his group at London, that did this. And they had taken a pressure cuff and showed that you could effectively measure like how much occlusion pressure it took to block off lymphatics. In a way not that dissimilar from how you'd measure blood pressure. And so that was really fascinating to me, is we can measure the pressure generation of these vessels that normally it's really hard to measure anything because they're very small and they're clear, and they don't have scatters. They don't show up in a lot of our standard clinical imaging tool approaches. So I remember seeing that thinking, we got to figure out a way to do this in the animal model. So we did it, and we chose the rat tail was the first time we did it. And I remember, I think this was an example where like the review process in science worked really well. Like we measured the pumping pressure in the rat tail, and we got a value, and then we submitted it, and a reviewer, came back and said, well, humans don't have tails, which maybe that. Okay, I agree. How is this relevant? And we were like, so we said, okay, well, we'll measure it in a rat leg too, or we did an arm. So let's do rat, because I think the cuffs we had didn't fit the leg very well, but we could fit the arm. So we said, we'll measure in the arm. And we measured it in the arm, and we got this pumping pressure value that was way less than in the tail. And we were kind of like, oh, great. So like, it's not the same. When you measure your blood pressure, I don't get huge differences where I put the cuff on. Like my blood pressure is my blood pressure. I mean, not by this was like 4 times less or something. And so we got really worried about this. And so then we thought on our rat arm, we were like, okay, well, we're injecting a tracer here, and then we're blocking off right here. And that's just, I think it was like 4 centimeters is what we ended up measuring or something like that. So we thought, but in the tail, we were injecting the tip and measuring 12 centimeters away. Maybe that matters. And so we went and we measured 4 centimeters away. And when we did that, we got in the same ballpark, the same pressure that we had measured in the arm. And that was the first time that it forced us to figure out what are we actually measuring when we measure pressure. What we realized is, and it's sort of obvious afterwards, what you're measuring, every single lymphatic vessel can generate pressure. And so the more of them you have in a row, the more pressure they can generate. And so there's a direct relationship between the length of the lymphangion chain and how much pressure. And we went to our computational models and sort of directly proved that with the measurements we got at 4 centimeters versus 8 centimeters versus 12 centimeters were directly explained by the fact that just the number of pumps you have in a row and how much pressure they can generate. So that was kind of, I don't know, from a sort of a nerdy basic science, like engineering standpoint, that was kind of a fun aha moment where it's, we understand now what this measurement means. And it's very different than what it means when you get a blood pressure measurement, right? Where you have a single pump providing all the force to your heart. That's not what's happening within the lymphatics. So maybe that'd be one example.
And what do you anticipate for the field for the near future, or maybe for the next 20 years?
Yeah, I mean, my hope. I think, the idea that we would have a single pill that every single patient that had any lymphatic disease would swallow and it would fix, I think is unrealistic. Like, that's not how we treat hypertension, and that's already narrow. Like, if we just said you have a heart problem, we need to know, do you have a plaque? Do you have a hormone that's abnormally elevated? And we figure out what the problem is, and then we have a therapy that is directed at that. I really hope we get there for lymphedema or lymphatic disease. I think it's unlikely that every single patient with lymphedema, it's all caused by molecule A, and we just need to give a drug to treat it. So I think we'll have diagnostics that can actually tell us why, either based on the genes, gene expression, or biomarker, why the person has lymphedema and what needs to be corrected. And then I do think we will have pharmacological approaches based on that underlying dysfunction that we can take for many patients to correct the problem. I also hope that we'll make major advances in our ability to direct the body's own ability to repair and regenerate lymphatics, and whether that's through sort of cell engineering or gene therapy or something like that, but actually be able to go in and not just find lymphatics that work and sort of rewire them through some kind of surgical process. No, let's actually get them to biologically regrow and be functional. So I hope all those things are within our sort of the say next 20 years.
You are a university professor who leads his own lab, but also you work as a professor teaching courses. What brings you the most joy in your everyday work? Yeah. What do you like the most?
I think my favorite thing is interacting and training like the leaders of tomorrow. The works in lymphatics is exciting. And I like that we get to work on a problem that's relevant. But, to me, the most effective way to just crank through lymphatic research and make advances would be like, let's go to a research center like the NIH and hire only postdocs and research scientists, and let's just solve the problem. But I like the university because we do that while also training the next generation of scientists. And so when they start, they don't necessarily know what they're doing or know anything. And that's maybe not the most efficient way to solve a medical problem or a biological problem. But what we're doing is we're raising up the workforce that's 20 years from now going to go out and solve all sorts of problems that we don't even know exist. And that part's fun. I like. So that's why for me, teaching and research are to some extent similar, because at one's you're in a classroom with maybe a large number of people, where another you're with a smaller group of people. But I don't know. That's why I stayed at university and why I came to begin with, because I like that process, and I like, I don't know. It's also the time where everyone makes every major decision that affects the next 40 years of their life. So it's kind of cool to get to be a part of that process and help people discover what they're good at and what makes them, what excites them and what challenges them, and being at Georgia Tech has been a wonderful place. I'm in mechanical and biomedical engineering, which are nationally ranked number 2, I think, in both of those at most of the time. And so that means we get the best and the brightest here. So I get to work with, just really smart people from all over the world, which is a fun thing to do.
Is there some question about lymphatics or in general that I should have asked you?
Question about lymphatics. Why don't we know more? Like, why are we so far behind? Because I would argue we're far behind. Yeah, I think it's just traditionally been underfunded, and often in the U.S., why a lot of advances or the advances made in a particular disease often track the money spent on making those advances, and why the money spent isn't always driven by like the number of patients that suffer from the disease or the healthcare cost. It's who got the ear of politicians and things like that at the right times to create a lot of momentum to solve the problem. So we have a cure. We have a treatment for AIDS because it was brought in the national spotlight in the 90s, and lots of money was put into it to move the needle forward forward quickly, and we just haven't had that quite with lymphatics. I think you can go and learn is Lymphatic Education Research Network is a great organization that's worldwide trying to promote, and they have the stat in there, but I think it's something like more people have lymphatic diseases than AIDS, Alzheimer's, and a couple of Parkinson's, and a couple of these that everyone knows combined. So if you take all those diseases and combine them, more people have lymphatic disease than those. But those diseases have done a really good job of raising awareness amongst the public, and then the public has said, "Hey, we need to fund these to fix these, to cure these diseases and help these diseases," and so the money's there, and then the science follows the money. And we're not quite there yet, I think, in the field of lymphatics. So, but maybe this documentary or we'll start that process. And there are lots of good people that are doing lots of good work to help raise awareness and do that, improve that. There's language in bills in the funding bill that's gone to Congress that requires them the NIH to show where they're spending money on lymphatic research as one example, and those kind of things are really important, and moving the needle forward.
Yeah, that's exciting. Thank you for your time again.
Yeah, sure.